My mother-in-law tried to humiliate me in public, but my husband chose me. Now she's out of our lives for good. I'm 27F, and to be honest, when I married into my husband's family, I didn't expect the amount of disdain I would receive from his mother. Let's call her J for judgmental. J comes from old money. Wealthy, established, the type of person who looks down at anyone whose family didn't own property 3 generations ago. She's the kind of woman who could spend an entire afternoon discussing how people need to know their place. And in her mind, I didn't belong in her world. See, I didn't come for money. My family was modest, maybe a little too modest for her taste. I worked hard, paid my way through college with scholarships and part-time jobs. And when I met my husband, we clicked immediately. He didn't care about my background or the size of my bank account. He loved me for who I was, and still does, thank God. But Jay. From the first time we met, she made it clear that I was not good enough for her precious son. It started small, of course. Passive-aggressive comments about my clothing or the car I drove or how interesting it must have been growing up in that kind of neighborhood. I brushed it off because I knew where it was coming from, her own insecurities, her need to control everything around her. My husband, always stood by me, but he has this blind spot when it comes to his mom. He's always believed that she means well deep down. I wanted to believe that too, but her jabs were slowly getting under my skin. And then came the party. Jay's birthday was coming up, and she always threw herself these extravagant events. Something out of a lifestyle magazine with champagne fountains, catering from 5-star chefs, and enough designer dresses to make a fashion week jealous. Of course, she invited us. Or, I should say, she invited R. I was just the plus one, even though I was, his wife. I wasn't keen on going, but R insisted. She's still my mom, he said. She'll get better. Just give her time. I wish I had trusted my gut. The night of the party, we arrived at Jay's massive estate, and from the moment I walked in, I knew I was out of place. Guests in designer gowns, everyone dripping in jewels, the kind of wealth you can smell when you walk into the room. But it wasn't the wealth that bothered me. It was the way Jay's eyes lit up when she saw me, like a predator spotting its prey. Darling, she exclaimed with her fake smile plastered on her face, arms wide open. I barely had time to brace myself before she hugged me, whispering in my ear, I'm surprised you found something decent to wear. I pulled back, trying to stay composed. Thanks for inviting us. Oh, of course, dear. We couldn't throw a party like this without the help, could we? She smiled sweetly, but the venom behind her words was unmistakable. I clenched my jaw and kept quiet. R didn't hear her. He was too busy chatting with some business acquaintance. Jay took the opportunity to lead me to the center of the room, where she introduced me to a group of her friends. This is RS wife, she said, giving me a once-over as if I were some kind of display item. She's not from our world, but we're doing our best to train her. The group laughed. I felt my face flush, but I didn't say anything. I was used to her digs by now. It was like being pecked to death by a duck. But what came next? That was something I didn't see coming. Later in the evening, Jay decided to honor me in front of everyone. She clinked her champagne glass, calling for attention, and with that same sweet but deadly smile, she said, Ladies and gentlemen, I just have to introduce you to someone very special tonight. I felt the pit in my stomach drop. What was she doing? She turned to me, gesturing grandly. This is RS wife, but what most of you don't know is that she's also our housemaid. The room erupted in laughter. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing, heart pounding. She continued, laughing along with everyone else. She's such a hard worker, scrubbing and cleaning, making sure we're all taken care of. Isn't that right, dear? The humiliation washed over me like a tidal wave. I looked at R across the room. He had heard. He was standing there, glass in hand, staring at his mother in shock. I could see the fire in his eyes, but he didn't move. He was frozen too, just like me. But Jay wasn't done. She pulled out her phone and showed a picture she'd posted online earlier, an edited photo of me vacuuming, dressed in what looked like a maid's uniform, a smug caption underneath, Can't escape your roots. I couldn't breathe. The laughter continued to ripple through the room as I stood there, wishing the floor would open up and swallow me whole. The blood rushed to my head. I wanted to scream, to yell at her, to tell her how disgusting and cruel she was. But my throat closed up and I felt tears welling in my eyes. Before I could react, R crossed the room in what seemed like an instant. His face was like stone, eyes cold, jaw clenched. He snatched the phone out of JS' hand and looked at the photo. For a moment, the room went dead silent, everyone watching, but he waiting to see what he would do. Then, he turned to Jay. His voice was low, but it cut through the air like a knife. What the hell is wrong with you? Jay's smile faltered. It's just a joke. Lighten up. A joke? You think humiliating my wife is funny? You think posting this online is okay? Her face went pale. It's not. Don't make such a big deal out of it, R. You know I'm just having fun. No, his voice was deadly calm now, which was scarier than if he had been yelling. You're not having fun. You're trying to humiliate her. You've been doing it since the day we got married. The guest shifted uncomfortably. No one knew where to look. The tension was suffocating. And you know what, Mom? I'm done. Jay blinked, looking genuinely shocked. Done? What are you talking about? I'm done with you. With this? He gestured around the room, disgust clear on his face. You think you can treat my wife like trash just because she didn't grow up with money? Because she's not one of your friends? No, I'm not letting you do this anymore. Jay tried to laugh it off, her voice shaking slightly. Don't be ridiculous. You were just cruel, and you've been cruel for far too long. If you can't respect my wife, then you don't deserve to be in our lives. Jay's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The guests were whispering now, eyes darting between us like they couldn't believe what was happening. Looked around the room. You can all stay if you want, but we're leaving. He took my hand and led me out of the room. I followed him, still in shock, my heart racing, my mind a blur. As we walked out, I heard Jay's voice behind us, shaky and desperate. Wait, you don't mean that. But he didn't turn around. We left without another word. In the car, I finally let the tears fall. I wasn't sure if I was crying from humiliation or from relief. Or maybe both. Reached over and squeezed my hand, his face softening for the first time since the party. I'm so sorry, he said quietly. I should have stood up to her sooner. I shouldn't have let it get this far. I shook my head. It's not your fault. My voice cracked. I didn't expect her to do something like that, in front of everyone. She's a bully, he said, his voice firm. And I'm done letting her get away with it. For the next few days, things were quiet. Jay didn't call, didn't show up. I think she was too shocked that her son had finally stood up to her. But then, of course, the fallout came. She called begging for forgiveness, trying to smooth things over. I didn't mean to hurt anyone, she cried over the phone. You're overreacting. It was just a party. Didn't budge. It wasn't just a party, Mom. You've been doing this for years. You don't get to treat my wife like that and then pretend everything's fine. She kept calling. Each time, RS response was the same. Not until you apologize, not until you show some real respect for my wife. And you know what? She never did. It took a few weeks, but eventually, she stopped calling. And I talked about it a lot, how to move forward, how to set boundaries with her, if she ever tried to come back into our lives. And we agreed on one thing. If she couldn't show me respect, she didn't deserve a place in our lives. After those weeks of silence, I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. Jay wasn't the type to back down without a fight. But as the days passed without any contact, I began to feel a strange sense of calm. The tension that had been hanging over my marriage since the day we got together seemed to lift. And I were closer than ever. For the first time, I felt like we were living on our own terms, without her constant meddling or cruel remarks shadowing us. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Jay didn't just go away quietly. That wasn't her style. It wasn't long before we heard from other family members. RS cousins, aunts, and even a few mutual friends reached out to him with the same message. You should forgive her. They tried to paint Jay as a misunderstood mother who had gone too far, but meant well. One of his aunts even said, "She's your mother, You only get one. You need to let this go." I could see the toll it was taking on him. He was close with his family, and they were putting the pressure on thick. You can't cut her out forever, they'd say. She's already been through so much. They painted Jay like a victim, as if she were the one wronged. But every time would shut them down. She didn't just make a mistake, he'd explain. She's been disrespecting my wife since day one. I'm not going to let her get away with it anymore. I admired how he stood his ground, but I could tell it was wearing on him. The guilt was building, and as much as I didn't want him to, I could feel him wavering. He loved his mother, despite everything, and that's what made it so hard. Then came the letter. One morning, a thick envelope arrived in the mail, addressed to in J's unmistakable, loopy handwriting. He sighed when he saw it, but I could tell he was curious. She hadn't written or spoken to him directly in over a month. He opened it, and his eyes scanned the page quickly, his expression growing darker with each line. I watched as his jaw clenched and his grip on the paper tightened. What does it say? I asked, already dreading the answer. He handed me the letter, and I skimmed through it. J's words were dripping with self-pity, the classic narcissist's apology. She didn't apologize for what she'd done. No, she apologized that we had been hurt by her actions. I never meant to make you feel so upset, she wrote. You're overreacting, I was just having fun, and it's a shame you took it so personally. At the end of the letter, though, was the real kicker. She invited us to another party at her house, a family reconciliation event, as she put it. She wanted to have everyone over to make peace and move on from the whole ordeal. I handed the letter back to R, my heart sinking. She doesn't get it, does she? He shook his head, disgusted. She doesn't want to make things right. She just wants to sweep it under the rug. For a moment, I wondered if maybe we should go. If we should just confront her again, try to work through it face to face. But then I remembered the humiliation I had felt at that first party, the laughter of those strangers, the way she'd posted that edited picture of me for the world to see. I couldn't put myself through that again, I wouldn't. I'm not going, I said firmly. R didn't hesitate. Me neither. But the phone calls from family continued. The pressure was mounting, and I could see R struggling with it. He was stuck between standing up for me and maintaining some kind of relationship with his family. I didn't want to force him to choose, but I also couldn't let myself be dragged back into Jay's toxic games. It all came to a head about a week later. We were sitting on the couch one evening when R's phone rang. It was Jay. He stared at the screen, debating whether or not to pick it up. Finally, with a deep breath, he answered. Mom, he said, his voice flat. I could hear her voice on the other end, shrill and accusatory. I've had enough of this. You can't keep ignoring me. I'm your mother. I demand that you come to the party. I saw the exhaustion in his eyes as he listened to her rant. She went on and on, alternating between guilt-tripping him and attacking me. I couldn't hear every word, but I caught enough to know she was still blaming me for the fallout. Your wife is manipulating you. She spat. She's turning you against me. This is all her fault. R closed his eyes, pinching the bridge of his nose. Mom, stop. This isn't about her. This is about you treating her like she's less than, and I'm not going to put up with it anymore. But Jay wasn't listening. You're my son. I raised you. You owe me your loyalty. That's when I saw it, the breaking point. R stood up, pacing across the room, his face a mix of frustration and hurt. Mom, listen to yourself. You're acting like I owe you something, just because you gave birth to me. That doesn't give you the right to treat my wife like garbage. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and then JS' voice came through, ice cold. If you don't come to the party, I'll make sure you regret it. I'll cut you out of the will. You won't see a dime of our family's money. R froze. His eyes flicked to mine, and I could see the internal struggle. Jay had just revealed her hand. This was never about reconciliation. It was about control, about using her wealth to manipulate her son into submission. She thought that dangling money in front of him would make him bend to her will. But she didn't know R like I did. He laughed. It wasn't a joyful laugh, it was bitter, dark, the kind of laugh you make when you finally see someone for who they truly are. Is that all this is to you? Money? He said, his voice steady, but filled with disbelief. You think I care about your money? You think that's why I married her, or why I've stayed in this family for so long? I could hear JS sputtering on the other end, trying to backtrack, but R wasn't having it. Keep your money, he said, his voice hard as steel. I don't want it. I don't need it. And if that's the price of being in your life, then I'm happy to walk away. He hung up the phone, his hands trembling. For a moment, we just stood there in silence, both of us processing what had just happened. It felt like the final nail in the coffin. Jay had pushed him too far, and there was no going back. She's going to cut you off, R, I said softly, knowing that the decision he just made was irreversible. I don't care, he said, his voice firm. I don't want her money if it means selling my soul. If she can't accept you, then she doesn't deserve to be a part of my life. That night, we decided to take a drastic step. R called a lawyer the next day to draw up paperwork for a restraining order. It wasn't something we wanted to do, but after years of emotional manipulation and that final threat, it became clear that Jay wasn't going to stop. If she couldn't control R with her words, she'd try other ways, and we weren't willing to wait around to see how far she'd go. The restraining order was served a week later. R's family was furious. How could we do this to his mother? They called us selfish, ungrateful, said we were tearing the family apart. But the truth was, Jay had done that long before we ever took legal action. In the months that followed, the silence from Jay was deafening. No more phone calls, no more letters, no more family members acting as her mouthpiece. It was as if she'd vanished from our lives overnight. And I built our own life, free from her toxicity, and for the first time, I felt like I could breathe again. Of course, there were moments when R would reflect on what had happened, moments of sadness and grief for the relationship with his mother that he wished he could have had. But he knew, deep down, that it was the right decision. Sometimes, people think they can control others with their money, with their influence, with guilt and manipulation. But at the end of the day, no amount of wealth is worth sacrificing your dignity, your happiness, or the people you love. And honestly, if I had to choose between dealing with her toxic behavior or living without that constant weight on my shoulders, I'd choose this freedom every time. So, here's a little advice from me. If you ever find yourself in a situation where someone thinks they can control you with money or guilt, remember this. Your peace of mind is worth more than any inheritance.